And for more analysis, I'm joined by international affairs commentator Douglas Herbet. So, Douglas, here we're seeing far fewer African leaders than at the last Russia-Africa summit in 2019 in Sochi. Why is that?
Because the world has changed. The geopolitical situation has dramatically changed, to put it mildly, since 2019. No little minor matter of the war in Ukraine sort of upending everything as we know it. Look, a lot of African leaders, even if they're very wary of publicly or explicitly saying so, are everywhere from angry to furious on the spectrum of emotion at Vladimir Putin for withdrawing unilaterally from a Black Sea grain deal, which essentially had been a lifeline for many African countries, especially those in the Horn of Africa, which otherwise millions of people could face malnourishment or even starvation. They are desperate right now to revive in some way their reassurances that they will still be getting that grain that is now essentially unable to get through. Hence, what we just heard Caroline reporting about, Putin looking for any way possible, short of rejoining that deal, of trying to make these sort of bilateral deals with certain African countries on a one-on-one basis, case by case, to get grain to them. And we're going to see more of that sort of, the Russians might call it creative diplomacy. The West would see it as basically far short of the obvious solution here, which would be Russia rejoining the grain deal. Look, what I take away from what Caroline's saying from Putin's initial comments here are that he is entering this summit. And you're asking me why far fewer? Why 17 African leaders versus 41 last time in a continent of 53 countries? So we're talking about a third of the continent's leaders there. Why? Because right now you have Putin on a back foot. He is flailing on the world stage, even if Russia obviously is going to paint an exact opposite picture of that. He needs to shore up support. He needs to shore up allies. He knows that he has been shunned and made a pariah by the West. In the absence of that, he has been looking, and with relative success in some cases, of finding allies in Asia and hopefully in Africa as well. Harder now to find support in Africa, but he's still doing so because a lot of the African countries are still, for better or for worse, dependent on him. So he's bogged down on the battlefield right now. He's withdrawn from that grain deal. He has a mercenary group there whose future right now is unclear, even if it says it's going to continue and remain a robust presence in Africa. There's a lot of outstanding questions here, but the picture you come away with is Putin in a defensive posture, even though the Kremlin is going to try to do everything to strike another posture. Officially, I'll show our viewers, the Kremlin is blaming the West for the fact there's so few people there. Its spokesman, let's see what he just said yesterday, I believe this was, on the eve of the summit, asked why there were so few people there. Once again, Russia turning the tables has nothing to do with Russia. It's always the West is the bogeyman. This is what he said. He said, this is absolutely blatant, brazen interference by the U.S., France, other states through their diplomatic missions in African countries, and their attempts to put pressure on the leadership of these countries in order to prevent their active participation in the forum. This has nothing to do, this is all disconnected from Putin's policies. Nothing to see here, look away. This is the West once again doing what it's historically always tried to do, which is undermine, humiliate, bring Russia to its knees.
Yeah, so you've touched on their food security and the future of the Wagner mercenary group. But another thing now looming over this summit is, of course, this attempted coup d'etat in Niger. How might this affect the way the summit's going?
Well, first of all, I mean, they're not completely disconnected issues. Remember, now, Mohamed Bazoum, who is the president, the deposed president by all the reports, he is a man who was obviously not in power during the inaugural Russia-Africa summit back in 2019. So when I talk about all these geopolitical changes, he's a relatively recent entrance to the presidential scene in Africa, which is actually a contrast with a lot of the leaders in the region who are either, leaders who came to power by virtue of coup d'etats in recent years, right? There have been, I think, 6 in the region since 2020 of various degrees, or they're just aging leaders who seem to be, withering and growing gray and grisly in power, never any signs of leaving. So he's a relatively new, younger entrant to the scene. He's not there right now. He was more seen as an ally of the West, right? Where did France move a lot of its troops to after Mali essentially kicked out the French troops to Niger? The U.S. has drone bases in northern Niger, and it sees the government there as very much a staunch supporter in its fight against Islamist insurgents in the region, in the Sahel region. So right now, it's definitely going to weigh on the summit because it's a reminder of sort of the divisions, if you will, the geopolitical political divisions on a continent where it's not black and white when it comes to who supports the West and who supports Russia. As we heard Caroline and a few others just saying, a lot of the African leaders don't really want to even take sides in what they see as this old Cold War rivalry. All they want is an end to this war. So the conflict in Niger is going to be, once again, a reminder of sort of the hazards and perils on a continent which has been riven by conflict, which has been riven by a lot of food insecurity, which has been riven by inflation, and which has been riven by a lot of migration issues. So it's definitely going to be looming large in the backdrop of this summit.